A war orphan makes her first friend. What happens after is miraculous. In 1946, what would become one of the most bloody and tragic conflicts in human history broke out in Tonkin, a region located in northern Vietnam. It was a conflict dubbed as the Anti-French Resistance War. In 1965, the Americans went from sending advisors to help in the conflict to planting boots on the ground, sending 3,500 Marines overseas to prevent a communist regime from taking hold over the country. Things took a dark turn for many of the innocent citizens of Vietnam. Nowhere was safe, and countless men, women, and children lost their lives in the fight that spread across the country like wildfire. Just as humanity is capable of performing atrocities that defy all logical reasoning, humans are equally capable of performing acts of unmitigated kindness and love. One such act was an American initiative known as Operation Baby Lift. This act was initiated on the 4th of April 1975 by American President Gerald Ford. It was a mission to evacuate over 3,000 orphan children from Saigon to America in the face of an offensive being launched by the North Vietnamese forces. An offensive that would have no doubt spelled the end for many of these innocent young boys and girls. One of these children was a young girl by the name of Linh Nguyen. Linh was born in a town of Trang Bang, 40 miles north of Saigon. She spent most of her life in a state of constant terror. Though she did not understand why, her mother and father always had fear-struck looks pasted across their faces, terrified of what would happen when the fighting eventually reached their small rural community. Her father was a farmer and her mother was a seamstress. They were well loved by many in their town, her father donating what he could from his crops to help with the famine that had stricken the country. Despite the horrors of war, young Linh was raised in a loving, if not cramped home, where she lived with her 2 brothers, her sister, her mother, her father, and both of her grandparents. One day when coming home from school, Linh and her siblings heard several loud noises coming from the market district. It was the North Vietnamese, and they were planning on taking the town to lay siege to Saigon. Linh's oldest brother realized something needed to be done, and he aided his siblings in escaping the fighting between the northern and southern forces by taking them around the market to the best of his ability. Unfortunately, he was mistaken for a fighter and lost his life in a hail of machine gun fire. The 3 remaining siblings managed to make it home, where their parents were preparing to evacuate the town for nearby Saigon. That's when the unthinkable happened. They heard a loud roar coming from the southern skies. It was a squadron of American fighters, at least a dozen F-100D aircraft. They were dropping several tons of napalm ordnance across the town, even on their own forces, and one of their planes was headed right for Linh's district. In the chaos and confusion, Linh and her mother were separated from the rest of her family as several homes were set ablaze and a choking haze of black smoke engulfed the town. Somehow, against all odds, Linh and her mother survived. They managed to make it to the outskirts of Trang Bang. They searched desperately for Linh's father, her brother, and her sister. However, Linh's mother was burned severely in the attack. Walking was pure agony for her. Linh was scared. They both wept until there were no more tears to weep, and they had finally given up. Linh's mother did the only thing she could. She took her exhausted daughter up on her back, told her everything would be alright, and began the long 40-mile journey to Saigon on foot. Along the way, both Linh and her mother were exposed to the barbarity of war. Families torn apart, the injured and maimed, desperate mothers, and fathers begging and pleading with passerby to help them find their children or asking if they had seen their loved ones on the journey south. Linh's face had taken on the forlorn, inward gaze and was typically reserved for children who had suffered through famine or terrible acts of violence, as well as other tragic events that have very unfortunately been all too commonly strewn throughout humanity's history. The pain Linh's mother felt when she looked into her face was worse than the pain she suffered from her burns. which began to look worse as the venture progressed. She needed medicine, a doctor to treat and bandage her wounds. But there was only suffering, sadness, and hatred. Hatred for cruelty and for war, and for those who perpetrated it from the safety of their homes. Against all odds, for Lynn's mother should have perished long before arriving in Sagen, they reached the city, and there, those responsible for her suffering were the most well entrenched. The Americans were here in force, preparing to launch a counter-offensive against the forces of the North in order to retake Lynn's hometown, a pivotal strategic point between the North and the South. There was no food, there were no doctors, and there was no help. Lynn's mother begged and implored to all who would listen, while her injuries only grew worse with each passing day. Nearly a week had passed when Lynn's mother noticed several men and women with their children heading to an American aircraft. When Lynn's mother asked a tear-stricken woman what was happening, the woman informed her that the North Vietnamese were going to be reaching Sagen soon, and that the Americans were rescuing as many children as they could fit into their planes before the fighting broke out, to bring them back to America. Lynn's mother, with the last ounce of strength she had, brought her daughter to the American airfield, praying for her ancestors to aid her, to help her convince the Americans to save her daughter. When Lynn and her mother finally reached the aircraft, she was too weak to speak. She could no longer carry Lynn, and Lynn was forced to walk on her own, holding her mother's hand and propping her up as best as she could with her tiny, malnourished body. Lynn's mother approached the first American soldier she saw, stumbling over to him, tears pouring down her red, soot-stained cheeks. All she could do was mouth the only English words she knew, "Please," over and over again. Her lips moved. "Please, please, please," she begged, falling on her knees and hanging her head. The American was in disbelief. This woman looked like she had defied all odds to reach him. He told her that he couldn't help her, that they didn't have any food or medicine to spare. He didn't have the heart to tell her that he couldn't waste resources on her because she wouldn't live much longer. Her burns were severely infected, and the infection was rapidly spreading through her body. He had seen this before, and he knew she wouldn't survive to see the end of the day. Lynn's mother looked up at him one last time, smiled, and shook her head. She turned to her daughter to face her, gave her one final hug, then pushed her towards the soldier. Lynn wept and pleaded for the man to help her mother as he took her into his arms and began to walk away as her mother collapsed in the dirt where she knelt. Lynn pounded on the soldier's chest in protest. She screamed, she begged, using the only English word she knew, which her mother had taught her in fear that the Americans would one day find their way to her town. "Please." Tears streamed down the soldier's face. He marched towards the landing strip as one plane took off after another. But by the time he arrived, only one aircraft remained, a private jet with a large rabbit printed on the rudder, known as the Big Bunny. It wasn't a large craft and could only support 24 or so children at most. The soldier pushed past the crowds that were surrounding it, raising the girl up for another American serviceman to take. He told the man that this one had to survive, no matter the cost. Her story was too tragic, too heart-wrenching, and she absolutely must live a happy, fulfilling life. And so she was taken, along with as many emaciated, terrified children as the plane could hold. Lynn was too distraught to pay any real attention to what was happening on the long flight to America, but she remembered how kind the women aboard the plane were in her later years, and how they gave her all the food she wanted, more food than she had had the privilege of eating in a long, long time. But she was too emotionally downcast to express her gratitude. She missed her brothers and her sister, her father, her grandparents, and most of all, her mother, who Lynn knew was gone. After several weeks of being housed in a temporary government facility, Lynn was relocated to an old building in the state of Maryland within the town of Baltimore known as Angel's Haven Orphanage. This was an orphanage run by a convent of nuns, and there were no men or boys here. Lynn was confused. The difference in culture was a terrible shock to her young, fragile mind. She didn't understand why the sisters made her pray to a god she had been told was not real, or why she had to learn to speak English, or why they hit her with a ruler when she spoke in her native tongue. But there was one sister, Sister Abigail, who treated her fairly and kindly. She reminded Lynn of her grandmother, who she still spoke to in her dreams when she slept. They were happy dreams of a life back home in Trang Bang when her family was still alive and well. Dreams where the war had never happened and her mother was still sewing her dresses, her father working in the fields, Lynn and her siblings trailing behind him as they played and laughed. After a year, Lynn learned to speak rudimentary English because of Sister Abigail's kindness and willingness to teach her. She told Sister Abigail about her own life and her family. When she spoke about them, it was like parts of them were still alive inside of her. Lynn now knew enough English to go to school with the rest of the girls. And while some of them picked on her because she looked different, Sister Abigail was always there to put an end to it, to explain that everyone looked the way they did because God decided it should be that way, and that it was wrong to laugh or point fingers or to talk about them like they weren't there. As time went on and years went by, Lynn was welcomed by the other children as well as most of the other sisters. As Lynn grew older, as too did she grow bolder. When all of the sisters were busy with their duties and she had finished her chores, she would sneak out of the orphanage in the afternoon. There was a playground nearby, just around the corner and out of view from the orphanage, that she liked to visit. Sister Abigail used to take her there regularly when Lynn was younger, before Sister Abigail, too, went to be with Lynn's mother and the rest of her family. Lynn knew that her family would take care of her sister in heaven, and while she was sad at first, she had grown to accept what had happened. She knew from a young age that people sometimes had to leave. One day, while Lynn was playing on the swings, her favorite part of the playground, another little girl sat on one of the swings next to her and told her she bet she could swing higher than Lynn could. Lynn was never one to turn down a challenge. She had determination and fire in her soul, just like her mother. Lynn swung with all the force she could, back and forth, higher and higher, until the other girl became frightened and told her to stop before she injured herself. The girl introduced herself as Jennifer. Lynn liked Jennifer. She liked how she cared about what happened to other people, always the first to say something if someone was being cruel to another or in danger of being hurt. Lynn began visiting the park every day if she could, and sure enough, Jennifer was always there waiting for her. Jennifer told Lynn that she lived and went to school nearby and stopped at the park every day after walking home from her classes. They played tag and hide and seek and all various other games, sometimes even with other children. The other children were always nice to Lynn when Jennifer was around. One day, when Lynn and Jennifer stayed out playing longer than they usually did, a beautiful woman and one of the most handsome men Lynn had ever seen approached them while they were sitting on the swings. At first, Lynn was scared. She didn't like strangers. Jennifer leaped off the swing and ran towards the pair, jumping into the man's arms and wrapping both of her own around him. He spun her around and laughed. This shocked Lynn. When Jennifer was back on solid ground, she told Lynn that they were her parents. Lynn looked on in awe. She had forgotten what it was like to have parents of her own, especially after Sister Abigail had passed. Jennifer told her she had to go home because dinner was ready. All Lynn could do was nod. Jennifer's mother asked Lynn if she would like to join them, but Lynn apologized and said she had to go. She turned and ran back to the orphanage. When Lynn was in her room later that night, she cried. She was miserable, but more than that, she was angry. She thought that it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that her friend had such a loving family while she had nothing. Even Sister Abigail was gone now. She had terrible dreams that night where she relived what she experienced in Vietnam when she was so young. She dreamed about how she watched her brother and mother die so tragically before her very eyes. She dreamed of her father, her grandfather, her grandmother, and her siblings, and she woke up screaming and trembling. The next day, she didn't bother to finish any of her chores. She wandered around the orphanage aimlessly, ignoring the sisters when they tried to speak to her, eyes downcast as she meandered through the halls to find a way to forget. All the sisters knew that Lynn went to the park every day, but none of them had the heart to try to stop her. Some wondered if something had happened and they were worried about her. One sister even encouraged her to go and play with her friends, offering to complete her chores for her. Lynn relented, and when she arrived, Jennifer was already there waiting for her. Jennifer called out excitedly like she always did, but Lynn's reply was barely a whisper. Jennifer knew something was wrong, that her friend was hurting. Lynn didn't want to talk about it, but Jennifer pushed and prodded and did not relent with her questioning until Lynn finally confessed what was on her mind. Lynn told Jennifer that she hated her, that Jennifer would never understand what it was like to lose all the people that she cared about, to lose her mother and father, and she wished her parents were alive instead of Jennifer's. This shocked Jennifer, and when it came out of her mouth, it shocked Lynn too. All Jennifer could do was stare at her friend, stunned, mouth agape and wide-eyed. Lynn burst into tears and ran back to the orphanage without looking back. Lynn was appalled with herself. Even for a 10-year-old girl, she was more self-aware than many adults are today. Lynn knew what she did was wrong. She knew that what happened to her was not Jennifer's fault, and she was certain that Jennifer would never forgive her. Still, Jennifer was Lynn's first and most cherished friend. She was a beacon of light in a life filled with sorrow, and the mere thought of losing Jennifer as a friend was enough to make tears well up in Lynn's eyes. That night, Lynn dreamed of her mother. She dreamed that she was there to console her after what had happened with Jennifer, that she told Lynn everything would be alright, and she didn't have to be sad or alone anymore, and that Jennifer would forgive her. When Lynn woke up, she decided that she would go to the park to meet with Jennifer. She would apologize whether Jennifer forgave her or not, and hope for the best. But when she went to the park, Jennifer wasn't there. Lynn waited and waited and waited. She waited until the sun started to go down, until, finally, one of the sisters from the orphanage showed up to bring her back. Lynn hung her head and followed in silence. As they returned, the sister was frustrated with Lynn. She asked her why she had stayed out so late and informed her that there were people at the orphanage waiting for her, and they had been there for several hours now. Lynn was confused. This was the first time anyone had gone to Angel's Haven and asked to speak to her directly. When Lynn arrived, she saw Jennifer. She was with both her parents. The sister that went to collect Lynn took her by both hands, knelt, looked her in the eyes, and smiled. She told Lynn that this family was here to adopt her, that she would finally have a home of her very own. Lynn was awestruck. She looked at Jennifer, who was grinning proudly from ear to ear, and then her new parents, who were fighting back tears because of the look on Lynn's face. Jennifer and Lynn had been friends for a year, and Jennifer always spoke of Lynn to her parents. She told them that Lynn was her best friend, and that she was an orphan who lost her family during the war in Vietnam. Jennifer's father, being a veteran of that war, felt for her on a deep personal level. He too had terrible dreams most nights. He could only imagine how this would affect a child. He felt it was his duty to provide her with a good life. Jennifer's parents wanted another baby ever since her father had retired from the army. However, due to the effects of a chemical introduced to Vietnam by the Americans known as Agent Orange, which Jennifer's father was frequently exposed to during the war, it was not possible for them to conceive another child. Jennifer and Lynn became sisters. They did everything together. They even attended the same college. When Lynn graduated, she went on to work for the United Nations, where she too helped children within war zones in desperate need of aid. When she was in her mid-20s, she went back to Vietnam for closure. That's where she reunited with her father and 2 siblings, who were still alive, well, and thriving in their old family home, which was reconstructed sometime after the worst of the war was over. Now, Lynn had 2 families to call her own, and to this day, she still lives in Baltimore with her husband. Every year, she visits her family in her childhood hometown of Trang Bang. Lynn named her first daughter after her mother, and her second after Sister Abigail.